Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Delighted to be here on stage with Secretary Paulson. And our topic of conversation today is green finance. As all of you know, to build a beautiful, big, modern, inclusive city, we need financing. Our mayors that we had together with the council and the city hall, Rahm Emanuel last year, they talked about this. But you, Secretary Paulson, are specifically interested in green finance. Why don't you tell us what that means and what the state of play is for green finance today?
Well, can you all hear me okay? Okay. So, well, it's interesting because green finance means different things to different people. To some, it means climate investment. I get hit up all the time for people who are coming to me and wanting me to make a donation for something which they call green finance, and it's philanthropy. But to me, I use a broad lens and say that green finance is financing an investment that goes toward sustainable development or low carbon clean tech investments. And it is critically important today because there are huge needs in the world and the governments don't have the funds that are needed, so they need to put in place the policies that are going to attract the private capital to these investments that are so urgently needed.
And the numbers are quite staggering. I think you cited in a New York Times op-ed, $90 trillion needed over the next 15 years to create sustainable design in cities to counter climate change?
Yeah, well, the numbers are huge, so you're right. And it's just to meet the Paris targets, and I think we need to do better than the Paris targets, but to meet those, it's 90 trillion, and governments have a small fraction of that. I spend a lot of time in China, and they're going to be spending anywhere from 600 billion to $1 trillion a year over the next 3 to 5 years to clean up their environmental mess, air, water, and soil, and the government can put in maybe 10 to 15% of that. And so that's the bad news. The good news is there's a lot of private capital. And so what we need to see are models, financing models, that attract the private capital to come and make these investments and do it in a way that they're commercially viable.
And so have you seen any good examples of those models? What's the appetite like for private investment into this space?
Well, so, Niamh, to take a look at this, the world's awash in capital. So there's huge amounts of private capital looking for good investments. Hundreds of trillions, 140 trillion in the global banking system, 100 trillion in financial institutions around the world, 200 trillion in debt and equity markets. So there's plenty of money there right now. The question is, how do you create the models, the incentives? And you can have regulatory incentives, you can have subsidies, you can have policies that promote this. You can put a price on carbon, as China's doing with their cap and trade system. And so what we're seeing is green finance start to go mainstream in places like China, well, I'll talk about that in a minute, and in Europe. And there's some growing interest in the US. And if there's not top-down government policies or incentives, we're finding that some institutional investors have programs because they find their clients want them to invest in green projects. BlackRock, which is the biggest institutional investor in the world, for instance, has now got a fund and is developing instruments. China, in particular, has made this a strategic imperative. And so the Paulson Institute, our Green Finance Center, does a lot of work in China as they're working to establish models. And they have the second biggest green bond market in the world. We've put in place, working with the Chinese government, a US-China fund to bring green, low-carbon technologies from the US to China. Because, again, the US has a big interest in this because, obviously, a ton of carbon emitted from China is every bit as harmful as one from the US or anyplace else.
So are you working directly with mayors then in China on this, or?
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about cities, and I will say we do have, the Paulson Institute does have a mayors training program, and where we're have mayors spend some time at programs in China and in the U.S. learning from some of the things we've done wrong, and some of the things, some of the mistakes we've made in the past, and some of the new ideas we have. But China is fascinating just because it is, urbanization. To step back a bit, the population of the world as it goes from 6 billion to 7 billion to 9 or 10 billion, whatever it's going to be in 2050, a lot of that growth is going to be, most of that growth is going to be in cities, and most of it is going to be in developing countries. And in many of these, if you want to be downbeat, you would say many of these countries don't even have municipal finance systems. And so it's going to be very, very important to develop models. And cities can play a very important role because that's where you have the transportation, the buildings, the solid waste. Citizens are demanding that mayors are responsive. And there's a lot of reasons for cities to lead. But it is going to take responsible policies and subsidies that have got to be set, I believe, at the national level. So let's take China as an example. So China is going to move 300 million people to the cities in the next 2 decades. That's massive. That's the size of the United States population. Now, in the past, this has been a model for growth, right? And I think most economists recognize the reason you get most of your economic growth in the cities is that's where you have the innovation. Why? Because it's where you get the talent, where you have the education, where you've got the highly skilled workers. And so in the past, you urbanize and you grow. But China is an example of how they need to change, because this next 300 million may give growth, but it won't give sustainable growth or prosperity or lasting growth unless they have new models. That they dramatically need new models, and they need different urban planning to build sustainability into this. They need new energy models. They need new economic models. They can't be as dependent on high energy intensive, hyper capital, intensive manufacturing. They need to move more to services. They need to be much more energy efficient. They need to redo their social structure. They need different household registration. They've got a couple 100 million immigrants that don't have access to services at the urban area. So there's a lot that needs to be done. I'll give you just one China example. So I think people understand that 40% of carbon emissions come from buildings. 60% of all new buildings are going up in China. And so if you looked at all of China's building floor space as being a consumer of energy, it would rank third behind the United States and China. And that the commercial floor space is going to double in China between now and 2050, and energy consumption is going to go way up. So getting the building codes right, and of course building codes are something that's done very often at the city or at the local level. So again, green finance, I think, is going to be very important. And the reason we spend time as we spend in China is that's where the big problem is in terms of carbon emissions. And the models they set can be very important for the rest of the developing world.
Did you ever think about taking mayors from America and bringing them to China to learn?
Oh, there's plenty of examples of mayors from the U.S. that go to China. and go all the time. And there's a lot to be learned. I mean, because the scale at which they're doing something is so large that, for instance, the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, has made one of his top priorities building this new model city outside of Beijing, Chang'an, which is just going to be this huge, smart city where they're going to take a different approach to transportation, a different approach to energy, and so on, and it's going to be a highly planned city.
So outside of green finance, then, Secretary Paulson, what other strategies do you think that cities can employ to be resilient and to keep moving towards achieving the goal of sustainability?
Well, the reason cities are so important is, to just take an example, I think 90% of urban populations are in coastal areas. And so cities are going to be the first to feel the impact of sea rise and climate change. And so there's a lot that cities can do in terms of resilience, in terms of where they build and having natural shorelines. And we spend a lot of time at the Paulson Institute focusing on coastal wetlands, for instance, because they are the ecosystem. The global ecosystem is, I think, reaching a tipping point when you look at the pressure on the entire ecosystem. But that part that is under the most pressure are the coastal wetlands, and they're being destroyed by urban reclamation. But when you look at, coastal flooding, events like Superstorm Sandy or, hurricanes, or that it is very clear having natural shorelines, they're much, much more resilient. I think there's strategies where the U.S. has been a leader and where China can learn a lot in terms of greening cities and making cities more livable, because there are huge social stresses in places like China where people move from rural areas living in high rises all stacked together on these huge unlivable blocks. And so green spaces. But I think the biggest lesson is it all starts with planning. If you don't have the right plan, nothing else really works. And so having the right plan at the outset that is built around sustainability.
Great. Well, we're delighted to have a conservationist like you out there speaking about these issues. Thanks so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.